and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about art, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. If you like what you hear today, and if you like any past episodes, then please like, subscribe, and share. Now, today's guest is a returning guest. Now, when we spoke to her last year, we were talking about her book, Technology is Not the Answer. This time, we're going to be talking about her letter of liberty, which is risk and responsibility. It's Timandra Harkness, and she's come to join us again. Hello, Timandra.
Hi.
Hi, hiya. Very good, pleased to have you on board. I read your letter of liberty online, obviously before this, and I really enjoyed it. I have a lot of questions to ask. Um, but the first question I'd like to ask is, why did you decide to write? Because I imagine the Academy of Ideas, who produces Letter of Liberties, they would have approached you to do this. So why did you decide to write on this particular topic?
I've been interested in risk for some time. And I'm at the moment, in fact, I'm working on a book proposal because I'd like to write a whole book about it. So it was really helpful when they said, we'd like you to write a letter on liberty. Is there a particular topic that you're interested in? I said, yes, I'd love to write about risk because I'm thinking about it at the moment. I took a show to Edinburgh to the Fringe in 2019 that was all about risk. And it's very interactive with the audience. So we can maybe talk about that a bit later. And I thought then, okay, well, I've kind of done risk now. I've got lots of ideas out there about it, and I'm going to leave it. And then I went away and wrote the other book you just talked about. The technology is not the problem, but risk just kept it like it keeps popping up in everything else that I write about. Like risk pops up again, and so I thought I should go back to this. I think there's more to be said. So yeah, so when they said, "Would you like to write one?" I said, "Yeah, I'll write about risk," and it really helped me clarify my thoughts because there's such little pamphlets that you can read in I don't know half an hour or something. You have to really get your ideas down to just what are the really important things, what's the really key thing you're trying to say here. So it's a very useful exercise for a writer, actually. If there's any writers listening that are thinking about writing something, and then the Academy of Ideas asks you, say yes.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And I obviously I've written one like a few years ago, so I know too well how hard it is to write. So congratulations on that. In regards to risk, because a lot of people now say, especially young people, they're not as risky as they were before.
Mm.
So my next question is, what affects whether we take a risk or not, and what factors affect whether we decide to do one thing or another that could be deemed risky?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, one answer is to say that we vary as individuals about how risk averse we are or how much we're willing to take risks or even how much we enjoy taking risks. And that does just seem to be partly a matter of personality and mostly also it's interesting that people will sometimes be more willing to take a risk in one aspect of their life but not another, so they might be quite willing to take physical risks like do dangerous sport but not want to take financial risks, so they don't want to put their money in some kind of risky fund that might go down. So we tend to have different attitudes to risk between individuals, but we're also very influenced by the society that we live in. I think that frames our overall approach to risk. And I think the society we live in has become more and more risk averse over the last, I don't know, a few decades, certainly, maybe the last 50 years or so. And so I think young people who are growing up now, maybe who've been born since the turn of the century, they Gen Zs? I lose
Yeah,
track. So I think they have grown up in a society that constantly tells them both that life is incredibly dangerous and scary, and also that it's actually quite irresponsible to deliberately take risks. If you think about kids moving from junior school to big school, which kids have done ever since we had this kind of education system that has a primary school or secondary school, and certainly when I did it, I mean, it was kind of it was kind of a big step because you've been there in, certainly for me, a much smaller school and you know everybody, and then suddenly you're in the and you're also you're the oldest, you're the big kids, you've been there the longest, you tell the little kids what it's all about, and then suddenly you go into a bigger school and you're the little kids now, and you don't know anybody, and lots of new things are being demanded of you. But when I did it, I don't remember it being described as, oh, this is going to be really scary and difficult. It was like, this is really exciting. This is a whole, you're turning into a more mature person. It's like another step towards being an adult. And it was intimidating, but we didn't feel that was a bad thing. It was like, well, it's intimidating because it's a new challenge, and I'm going to be a bigger kid, and I'm going to the big school. But now kids are told that it's a really frightening thing and that they're going to be anxious, and they're given lots of preparation and almost psychological counseling to prepare them. And if you tell kids that it's going to be scary and risky and they might be upset, then obviously they are going to feel that way because you've primed them to do that. So I don't think you can blame young people for being less willing to take risks, because the risks of everything are bigged up to them. And the idea that part of becoming an adult is that you rise to things and you take on the risks and you grow and become stronger is not there. It's like the idea is, no, no, you need support, you need counseling, you need help. And if you feel anxious, that's fine. You can go away and withdraw somewhere and run away from the situation. So I don't really blame young people for feeling that risk is something you should avoid, because it's also framed, I think, as it's almost like a moral imperative to not take risks. That if you take risks, you're a reckless person, you're an irresponsible person.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Do you think with young people, the risks they do take have become more political? And what I mean by that is in regards to protest, like they're willing to risk protest and arrest and being arrested if it goes away, if it's something political they believe in. But then if you look at outside of that, the risk they're taking isn't that great. Like, for example, and I say this to someone who's teetotal, but less young people now are drinking alcohol, for instance. And it seems to me that any risk that young people take today, it tends to be more politicized in that taking political action. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that lots of little habits that certainly were very normal when I was a teenager, and we'd go and drink. I mean, things were a bit less formal then. So
Yeah.
if you looked like an 18-year-old, then a pub would serve you. You didn't have to go to the trouble of faking ID or anything. And we certainly did. Yeah, we did more of that. I don't know about drugs. I think maybe just the kind of drugs has changed, but also having relationships, like dating and sleeping with people. I think they're doing less of that as well. So that's a kind of emotional risk that they're avoiding. The political question, I think, is really interesting because obviously, yes, there's quite a lot of young people going on protests and being willing to be arrested. But I would say that in a couple of ways, they are also slightly risk averse. And one of them is a thing that I think young people have always done, which is that you stick with your tribe. So yes, you might go along and go on a big demonstration and be willing to be arrested, but you're not doing it on your own. You're joining your tribe of people, and you think, okay, these are my people. I agree with them. I want to stand for the things that they stand for, and I want to show that I am part of the group. And part of that is that I'm going to go along and maybe risk getting arrested, because so in a way, it's like, yes, they're taking the risk of getting arrested and having consequences themselves, but they're not taking the risk of turning around to the tribe and saying, well, I don't know. I don't actually agree with this. I'm not sure we should be demonstrating against this. I think this is wrong. Which, as I say, I think young people have always gone, I'm learning about the world. I'm going to find my group of people that I feel at home with. And if they think this, then I'm probably going to agree with them. I don't think that's new. But the other thing is there is a weird thing about some of the people doing things and then getting arrested is they almost seem to feel like the authorities should look after them, and
Mm.
that getting arrested shouldn't really have consequences for them, that it should be a kind of a performance, like we go along and we block the road or whatever, and then we're taken away and arrested, and we're heroes, we've done our bit. But then the idea that you actually have those consequences, like, well, you've been arrested, you've blocked the road, and now you're going to go to prison for 2 years, that seems to be met with almost disbelief. And not only them, but sometimes their parents. I mean, there's been some cases of environmental protesters where they get arrested and they get put in prison because they've obstructed the highway or whatever. And somebody's parents said, well, no, but this is, you can't keep her in prison because she's got to come to Thailand to her brother's wedding or something. I forget exactly. I think that's not how this works. It's like getting arrested and being put in prison means you're arrested and you're in prison. And if you weren't prepared to take the consequences, maybe you should have thought about this before you blocked the road. Almost like almost like the police and the courts and the prisons are just another version of your mum, or of school. It's like school detention, but obviously, you do detention, but they're obviously going to let you out if you've got to go to a wedding in Thailand. They can't be serious about this. So
Yeah.
in some ways, I feel like maybe they don't really always understand what exactly is this risk that they're taking, because don't because they feel that actually the authorities are basically there to look after them in the same way that their parents and schools are there to look after them. That is this making sense to you?
No, it does make sense, and but it's funny because I was thinking what you're describing, especially when you talk about the example you give with Thailand. It sounds like almost an upper class stereotype you sometimes see in some dramas where the young boy who's from a very rich family has gone to a prestigious private school. He does something really bad, I mean, really serious, almost to a crime. And then he'll get his mummy and daddy to bail him out because they've got the money to get the best lawyers, etc. And it seems like that's spread through from what you're saying, not just through young people who are like very upper class, but just filtered down, albeit in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect you're right though. I think this particular case, I say I can't remember the name or the exact details, but I think it was a relatively obviously well-off family if the brother's going off to be married in Thailand or something. Um, yeah, but I think you're right. I think that it is kind of percolating downwards. I'm quite sure that if it was some like teenage kid from where I live in Woolwich and they went and got arrested, then there would be no question of them of anyone even daring to ask if they could be let out to go abroad to a wedding. So I think the class thing is still there. But yes, you're right. I think that kind of expectation that nothing really bad is going to happen to you is because, you're clearly doing the right thing and just getting arrested like in a good cause. And so it's not the same as actually committing a crime. I think that is quite widespread. Yeah, and you see it as well in some of the, there's quite a lot of older people get arrested on protest, and then there's this, oh, this is terrible. This retired lady from the home counties is being arrested and put in prison just for this protest. Like, yeah, but it was pretty clearly signaled that people who did that protest would get arrested. So again, she's like,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
did
yeah.
know surely what she was risking at this point.
Is do you think, I know we talk about young people a lot and we'll move away from that, but do you think the risk of young people, and you mentioned this in an example where you talked about going against a tribe, but do you think the risk of young people going against a tribe has actually increased? I.e., not just with social media, almost using that as a tool to shame, but also things like cancel culture. Whereas before, if you shamed a group, it just stayed within the group and any consequences were more localized. Whereas now, the consequences could be a little bit more far reaching.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. I think that's very fair. That, yeah, exactly. And social media is obviously part of that because you might say something and then somebody can go digging back through your social media feed for years and say, oh, yes, but 5 years ago you said this, and therefore we're going to have to throw you out of the tribe. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's become a much bigger risk in that sense, the social risk of that. And it can have bigger consequences. So it might be that you not only fall out with your friends, and that's no small thing, especially when you're young, especially I think when you're a teenager, falling out with your friend group is a big deal because your friends are really important. But also maybe you lose your job, or you find your job very difficult, or you could no longer work in the field that you were working in because you've been thrown out of your tribe for not meeting the purity standards. So yeah, you're right. Even though I say I think we overstate the dangers of social things and that we should be more robust about it, you are right that the nature of those risks has kind of escalated. I mean, I live in hope that we will come back from that
Yeah, yeah,
extreme of
yeah,
everybody has to watch what they say, otherwise they get cancelled and thrown out. But I'm not sure it's happening yet.
yeah. Indeed. It's again another point you made earlier, and you talked about risk. How we'll take risk for some things, but not others. And you talked about some people will take a physical risk, but not necessarily a financial one.
Yeah.
So would that be because of both in terms of competency and experience and education that would affect the types of risks that you take?
It's definitely partly that. Yeah. I mean, I think it is, I genuinely think it is partly personality. And some people are just much more open to risk and seeing what happens than other people are. But there's some quite interesting research about, for example, I mean, risk aversion in general, but also particularly financial. And unsurprisingly, I think it finds that people whose general social situation is more precarious are more averse to taking risks. And there's even a theory, because one of the kind of robust psychological findings, the difference between the sexes is that women tend to be more risk averse than men. And there is some theory that maybe this is literally like a physiological thing, like testosterone makes you more willing to take risks. And that's perfectly possible. But there's also some quite interesting theory, which is, yeah, but if you look at just the reality of society, women are often in a slightly more precarious situation in terms of maybe finance or options open to them or whatever. And so maybe it's partly that people who have fewer resources, if things go wrong, are more risk averse because, if you've got nothing to fall back on, then it can be catastrophic if you lose what you've got. Whereas, if you've got the support of a family and, family could bail you out financially or practically, then it might feel more doable that you can risk something. You don't want it to go wrong, but if it does go wrong, you're not going to be on your uppers. You're not going to be on the street or anything. So yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. Coming back to your earlier point about this kind of generational shift, I think what's interesting there is that I think the younger generations feel more precarious, even though in many ways, practically, their lives are less precarious than, say, their grandparents or great grandparents. I mean, if you just look at the reality of life in Western democracies, our lives are much more secure and safe than any previous generation ever, really. But they don't necessarily feel that way. And I think that's partly about looking at the future and younger people looking at the future and going, well, I don't know what the future's going to look like. Everybody keeps telling me that, the economy is in a terrible state and I'll never be able to afford a house and maybe we're headed for a war and the environment is ruined and there's a general air of the future is going to be worse than the present. And again, if you've grown up with that, you can't really blame people for feeling anxious about the future and that maybe they don't want to take a risk because anything that you do that involves risk is going to make things worse. I think that's a sorry, and this is weird. I've just noticed the laptop's not plugged into the mains. Yeah. I think if you have a sense that the future's going to be worse, then obviously anything you do that's a risk, you're more worried about what if it goes wrong and makes things even worse than you are thinking, oh, well, I could take this risk and things might be better. So there's a kind of there's the practical reality. They're like, if you don't have loads of spare money and you don't have a family who could bail you out, then yeah, it's very sensible to be more risk averse. But there's also the psychological setting, which is if if you're constantly thinking, oh, the future's going to be worse than the present, and the future is very unpredictable, and the future is full of terrible things that might happen, like wars and environmental collapses, then again, that's going to set you up to go, right, okay, well, I should try and be cautious then and not risk putting myself in an even more precarious situation than I feel I'm in, even if objectively you might look and go, listen, 100 years ago, your ancestors were like literally doing a runner from their rented house because they couldn't pay the rent, putting everything on a cart in the middle of the night and showing up somewhere else and not having a job and, literally living hand to mouth. But it doesn't feel like that if the future is uncertain.
Yeah. Is it also true though that you can hit rock bottom to such a state that you decide to take a risk because you got nowhere else to go? You have to take a risk to get yourself out.
Yeah, I think that's also true. The sense you've got nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and again, it's partly about personality and how you respond. And you go, well, the same people in the same situation might go either, listen, things are bad enough already. I'm not going to risk them getting worse. Or, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to go for it because the worst is not much worse than I am now. And the best could be a load better. And there's lots of factors. I mean, it's partly personality. It's partly whether you think there's a realistic chance of you being able to pull something off. Maybe it's partly your relationships with other people. It's like if you're responsible for a bunch of other people and you take a risk and it fails, then you've also taken a risk on their behalf. If you're not, if it's just you, I think it's much easier to make those decisions because it's very interesting. We tend to be much more risk averse for other people than for ourselves. We tend to be much more willing to take a risk that only affects us. Not that not that there's many risks that really only affect us, but you know what I mean. It's like if you have a family, if you have 5 children and you're living in a house, you're not going to put the rent on a horse and risk all of you being homeless. But if it's just you, then you think, well, it's my money, it's my risk.
You say that about the horse, but one of the behaviors that associated is with risk is gambling. And
Yeah.
especially if you're a gambling addict, you're looking for that high every time. And I know stories, and I've interviewed people on here who gambled, even though they've had a family because they wanted to get that high.
Mm.
So, is there a biological aspect to it or psychological in the sense of the certain risks that you'll take because you just, for want of a better word, you're biologically predispositioned to be that way? Um, and you just take it anyway, regardless of any further risk. Like you're willing to put a bet on, that's a very high bet, even though your family could be at risk of not being able to pay the rent because you've got you're gambling addicts and you've got that high. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. So you're hooked on the buzz
Yeah,
of
yeah.
gambling. Yeah, I find that very interesting. I don't have that at all with financial gambling. It's really it's definitely not one of the kinds of risks that I enjoy at all.
Mm.
Um, except, in a very tiny, manageable way. So, I'll put like a fiver on a football team like once a year or something. But I know for people that do, there is a huge buzz, and I'm quite intrigued by what it is. It's like, is it the possibility of winning, or is it the possibility of losing? Is it the danger or the kind of hope? It does seem to be something that if you've got the kind of personality that's going to get addicted to something, and especially to something that's potentially very destructive, that gambling is one of the things, that you might. So you might be addicted to gambling and then manage to give that up, but then find that you're struggling with alcohol and you're kind of addicted to alcohol or
Mhm.
things like that. And that's obviously a problem. And in a sense, I think one of those things where you have to deal with the addiction. I'm not a psychologist or a counselor, but I think that you have to deal with the addiction side of it. It's like what is it that you're needing that you're currently getting from that buzz of gambling? Because obviously, and most people know, most people who gamble know that in the long run, the bookie always wins because otherwise the bookie would go out of business. That's just how these things work.
Mhm.
It would be like, yeah, why would you, in the long run? you're never going to win against the bookie, because if you did, then they wouldn't be able to make a living. But obviously, when you're addicted, you kind of know that. But like you say, you can't stop going back for the buzz. But in a way, I mean, you could look at other people who do physically risky things, for example, and say, what is it about this? Most people don't want to get injured with climbing or, I don't know, motorcycle racing or whatever it is. But the fact that it's risky is definitely a part of the whole experience. And I guess one of the challenges for us as humans is that there's obviously something in us that seeks out risk and risky things to do, risky actions, for the sake of that feeling of, can I pull this off? Is this, I'm going to make myself, if you like, vulnerable to chance at this point, or vulnerable to my own skill levels. Can I pull this off? I don't know. I'm going to find out. And in some ways, I think that's really healthy, because it's that, but not so much gambling, because although I guess if it's something like horses where there's an element of skill and you're using your judgment, then yes. But the kind of putting money on roulette or something is purely a game of chance. But most things that involve risk, there's some element of testing yourself, testing your skill and your judgment, and seeing if you can pull it off. And that can be really healthy, because it makes you push yourself and find out where the limits are of your skill or whatever. But obviously, you don't really want people doing it to the extent that, I mean, obviously, you don't want people being addicted to gambling, but also, ideally, you don't want loads of people getting killed and injured doing physically risky things. But at the same time, if you prioritize safety over everything else, then our sphere of what we can do and testing ourselves becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so our sense of what we can do also becomes smaller. I mean, it's very noticeable that teenagers are, they really do go through a phase of life where they have to take risks. It's almost like a compulsion to take risks. And that is part of, and they have to take risks with their friends and, in front of their friends. It's very much part of that whole moving away from your parents and changing your social focus to your groups of friends. Taking risks is very important in that. Which I think, again, is kind of intriguing, because it suggests that part of discovering who you are and building your personality and your identity in the world is to take those risks and test where the edges are and where the boundaries are, and how far you're prepared to go, but also how far your social circle will let you go, and all that kind of thing. And that suggests that it is a really important part of developing as a fully formed adult, to take risks. So we've gone rather a long way there from your initial question about
No, it's an interesting
gambling.
point. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about physical risk, and
Yeah.
obviously to add to something like financial risk, because I think with physical risk, even though people are willing to do something risky, whether it's climb mountains or do stunts in cars or whatever it may be, yes, it's a risk, but there's still an element of safety there. You do all the safety checks, you calculate what can go wrong, what can go wrong, but you make sure it goes as smooth as possible. But there's still a high risk there. I think
Yeah.
with something like a gambling, and well, not just gambling in terms of financial, but also gambling in terms of a stock market, for instance. I think of someone like Nick Leeson, was it Nick Lesson, was it? The Barings Bank, where he bet
Oh, yes. Yeah, Nick
those
Leeson, yeah.
stocks and all that, and it ended up like the company ended up going bankrupt as a result. It's literally almost, okay, I've seen this money, I'll put it on there, and then just collapse. There's almost no thought into it. Now, obviously, if you've been in a role for so many years, you develop experience, and then you do things a lot more efficiently. But even but with financial risk, it seems that even especially like gambling and putting like buying stocks in companies and stuff like, yes, there is a research behind it, but it seems a lot more compulsive almost compared to physical risk, which are compulsive to a certain degree, but there's still a massive safety element to it.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're definitely right that most people who do physically risky things try to do them in a way where the risks are constrained. And like, yeah, like you say, you try and foresee what the dangers are going to be, and contain them, if you like. The financial gambling thing, I think, is very interesting because you've got, I mean, you have got like literally addicted compulsive gamblers, and I don't think they're not thinking at all about, oh well, in the long run this will work out. So I think it's just a genuine compulsion. It's a very instant buzz, almost like, as you said, like a biological thing. But when you talk about financial institutions and the betting and the whole, I mean, the financial crash, whenever it was, 2008, was it? And a lot of people said, oh, the problem here was that all the, like the stock markets and so on, were taking too much risk. And so there were a lot of controls put in after that to stop people taking those risks, people like, Nick Leeson and so on, because it was built into the way the financial markets worked, that the way to get big returns for a lot of investors was to take big risks. Because you literally were gambling, not even so much often on whether this company that you've put money into is going to do well and have profits, but it was like, well, I'm going to gamble on what the price of this is going to be in 6 months or a year's time.
Mhm.
It's like really not that different from me for my sins, which must be many. I put some money on Liverpool to win the league. And
Mhm.
what's maddening me now is that not only are
Mhm.
they clearly not going to win the league because they're
Yeah.
playing rubbish, but I didn't even put it on at the highest rate. If I put it on now, it'd be 10 to 1. So I'd win 100 quid in the unlikely event they did. But when I put it on, they had just won one match. So it's 3.5 to 1. So a lot of the financial market stuff, and I think it still is more like that. It's more like saying, what do you think? Not even saying, are they going to win the league, but like, what's the almost like I'm going to bet that the odds will be 10 to 1 in a week's time. So it's really kind of, I mean, they're talking about derivatives, but it's like second and third derivatives. It's just playing games really with numbers. And that was how the stock market's geared up. And I think largely still is. And that was, and people were rewarded, people who worked in it were rewarded for doing that, because if they did that and it came off, they would get big money for their company, and so they get a big bonus and so on. And the whole thing was just a game, really, just crazy amounts of money, not actually going into making anything or doing anything. And I think in some ways the idea of risk, the idea of financial risk, got all lumped in together. So that kind of crazy gambling on the price of a thing in the future got lumped in with the kind of risks that you want people to take in the stock markets, which is you want people to go, here's an interesting startup with a new technology, or let's take the mini nuclear reactors, right? And they're finally going to build some mini nuclear reactors on Anglesey, I think, and start producing electricity for the grid, which Lord knows we need. That kind of investing in newish technology that we need as a society, that's the kind of thing you want investors to do. You want people who have a load of capital to go, right, well, we're going to invest in this company which is working this new technology, and we're not sure it's going to work, but if it does, it'll be hugely successful because we need it, and so it will sell loads, and so the company will be worth a lot of money. And if it doesn't work, well, we'll just lose a lot of money. And that's how capitalism is supposed to work in theory. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not really doing much of that at the moment, but that's the idea. This is the theoretical justification for people owning companies, is that they take the risk. If the company, if the nuclear thing turns out not to work that well, they've just lost a load of their money. If it does work well, they share in the profits. Instead of which, what generally happens is more like the water companies, where instead of investing in the infrastructure we need to get water and sewerage, they built kind of shell companies on top of each other and lent each other money. And somehow all the money's gone out into people's pockets, and still nothing has got done. But actually, so a positive example is COVID. Like when they
Mm.
started, they went, right, okay, we really need vaccines. That's the only thing that's going to get us out of this nightmare scenario. And there's various different candidates for what's going to be the most successful vaccine. And what the UK government did was, right, we're going to put a chunk of money into a number of them. And by investing at the beginning, we'll not only speed up, hopefully, the development, So they'll be able to do all the tests they need to do, but do them really, really quickly rather than having to wait for funding and wait and wait. But also, that will give us like a priority in actually getting the vaccines once they work. And not all of them did work, but there was a couple that the UK government invested in that did work, and so they got developed really quickly. And the ones that did work, we got like priority access to. And that's the kind of thing you're like, yeah, that's the kind of risk you want financial markets to take. You want to invest in things that we need, knowing that not all of them will work. But yeah, the kind of Nick Leeson type stuff where you're just basically betting on what the prices of things are going to be next year. The only people to make money out of that are the people in the financial markets. And I don't know, I guess theoretically people who have pensions whose money is in the blah blah blah. But it's not really helping society because it's the same money going round and round and round again. It's not actually going into making anything that's going to make our lives better.
Yeah. Talked about young people, and I even remember this phrase when I was a teenager growing up of wrapping them up in cotton wool.
Oh yeah.
And obviously, if you do that, then obviously the amount of risk they're going to be exposed to is minimal. Where did that start? Because that seems to have gone for a long time, while now, and it's like, where did it start that we decided we're going to wrap them in cotton wool, figuratively speaking? So why
Yeah.
idea?
Well, no, you're right. It has, and because there's a lot of people now say, "Oh, it's social media," uh, and there's new dangers of social media, but also that kids are indoors on social media and they should be out, and playing on trees and stuff. And it's like, no, no, it started long before that. I think I don't know. I mean, it's a good question how far back it went. I guess maybe. I mean, on the one hand, it's like society has got safer. It's got safer and safer and safer, and that's a good thing. The number of people dying in road accidents actually goes down over time. If you look at the figures from the 1960s, how many people were killed in road accidents? It's horrifying, even though there were fewer cars on the roads and so on. So there's maybe a small element of society has got safer, and so we just expect it to be safer, and we expect that to be the trajectory. But I don't know. I think maybe the way we think about people, the way we think about ourselves and each other, I think has changed. And I'm not sure when that happened. I think maybe in the 80s. It really started the idea that you can't expect people to just cope with bad stuff happening, that you actually should protect people from bad stuff happening. And obviously once that's going, then that's going to escalate, partly because then you get parents who are thinking about the world in that way, and then they think about their kids like, oh no, I must protect my kids. I can't let them go out there and take risks on their own. It's my job to protect them, and again, that's going to escalate from generation to generation if you don't stop it. I think there was a change in society in the 80s ish when like the world was changing, and the idea that the jobs of government was to keep societies improving, and that economic growth was going to keep on going, and that everybody's lives would get better because we were generally getting richer. That kind of lost its momentum, I guess, in the 70s, the recessions in the 70s, and that the post-war boom was over, and you couldn't just go, oh well, okay, so capitalism has no great moral purpose, but on the other hand, I now have a car and a fridge and a washing machine, which my grandparents didn't have. So you've got to at least admit that our lives are getting materially better because we have more time for good stuff. And then that kind of didn't really happen. And then the Cold War ended. So the idea that Western democracies could go, well, okay, it's not perfect here, but at least it's not like over there. At least you don't have the secret police watching you. At least you're free to express yourself and wear jeans and all that kind of thing. So that went away because they had no one to contrast themselves against. And so I think there was a real loss of sense of purpose. And then at the same time, you've got environmentalism coming in, which on the one hand is like, oh yeah, well here's a new sense of purpose. You know, we can all respect nature, and we can start looking after the planet, and that could be our new sense of moral purpose. But unfortunately, that also comes with this impending sense of worry and doom. So we don't have to worry about nuclear war anymore, but we do have to worry about, you know, pollution and then climate change and all that. And out of that, I think, came this idea that you can think about risk, and that can be your organizing principle can be that you should keep people safe and you should reduce risk. And the idea that some of the risks are these rather intangible environmental risks means that it's a kind of, it becomes a constant, you know, it's a mission that you can never forget about, because
Mhm.
because there might be invisible risks somewhere from radiation or pollution or whatever. Uh, and I just think somehow, I mean, there was a particular book called The Risk Society by Ulrich Beck, who was a German sociologist, and he wrote this book that came out coincidentally the same year that Chernobyl had its accident,
Okay.
which is very weird. I was rereading the book recently, and he is really obsessed with radiation and radioactivity. And you think, when Chernobyl happens, like the book probably came out and then Chernobyl happened, and he would have been there like, yes, see, I told you so. It's all about radiation, radioactivity. Uh, and And his thesis was basically like, look, you know, forget industrial society. Everybody's got enough now. We don't need any more stuff. We move into post-industrial society, and what we should, instead of trying to fairly share out the good things that we produce from industrial society, we should try and fairly share out the bad things that we've accidentally produced, which are basically risks. And
Mhm.
we should, you know, forget about sharing out the goods, focus on sharing out risks fairly so that nobody is unfairly at risk. And it's a very negative, very negative way of seeing society. But it was really influential. It was like Tony Blair's advisor, Anthony Giddens, got the English translation in the early 90s, I think, and was really like, yes, yes, this is what I've been looking for. So it became a very influential way of thinking about the world. And again, for like political leaders who must have felt a bit like, well, what's my mission now? I can no longer promise continuing economic growth to everyone. I can no longer say, well, at least we're free, not like those people over there. I'm not really sure, you know, what have I got to offer
Mhm.
the country, apart from just keeping things running a bit better. And then, so the idea that you're able to keep people safe, it became this very attractive principle. Like, your job is to keep everybody safe and reduce risks. And 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 I just think that it's kind of insidiously grown as an idea that that's the point of society, is to keep people safe. So
Mhm.
so again, it's like, yeah, individual parents especially have soaked this up, but I think it's partly because I mean, ironically, maybe it's there invisible like radiation.
Mhm.
So just this idea that the morally good thing to do is to keep people safe and to reduce risks. And since there's nothing to compete with that, it's like, if you think of a wartime situation, right? The Second World War, obviously they did try and keep people safe to some extent, but there was this sense that, yeah, but we've got this overarching purpose, which is that we're at war and we don't want to be invaded, and we've got to win this war. We're standing for, you know, democracy and freedom or whatever. And so safety is not the most important thing. And,
Mhm.
you know, we routinely expect you to go out and fight and risk your lives, and not all of you will come back. And even civilians in the industrial centres, you know, you're going to get bombed, and we'll try and keep you safe as much as possible, but some of you are going to die, and that's it. But if you don't have any kind of organising principle that's more important than safety, then safety is just going to become the thing that you care most about. Now, obviously, parents with kids has always been different, because
Yeah.
nobody wants their own kid to go out and fight a war or whatever. There's a natural tendency to parents to want to protect their kids. But I think when you don't have a kind of social setting that says, you want to protect your kids, but you also want to grow them to grow into
Mhm.
adults, to play a role in society, and to move out into their own lives. When you don't have that, then why wouldn't you just keep protecting them for as long as you can? And the more people tell you that the world is a scary, risky, dangerous place, then the more you're going to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I was just wondering again when you're speaking there, how much does a want of social belonging and also a fear of social isolation affect whether someone takes a risk or not? And particularly, I'm talking about something like debates,
Mm.
where you'll want to talk about certain subjects, but you have that fear because you know you might get socially um, isolated. Like, for example, there's in one of the papers today in the front, there's talk of an horrific crime that happened to a young girl, but people knew about it, but there was a certain fear of telling authorities because of what the blowback they could get. I'm trying not to go into too much of the crime, but that sort of thing where you can argue it's a risk in a sense because you could be humiliated, you could take it, be the wrong end of the stick and could be humiliated from that. But in a way, it's a risk worth taking because it's someone's life, but people don't because of the fear of doing that. So, how much does a fear of social isolation and also a want of social belonging affect whether you decide to take a risk or not?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's very strong. It's really strong because we're social creatures, and we can't live without each other. I mean, it's not kind of weird to care about what other people think and whether we're going to be socially isolated. It's a very sensible thing to worry about. But you're right. I think the fear of the fear of people jumping to conclusions and of never being able to defend yourself is strong and is justified. But it does have the awful things. I remember I mean, yeah, I know the case you're talking about. It's a little girl, and the neighbours were worried. But some of them thought, oh well, we don't want to say anything because it might appear that we're just doing it because we're racist. But I remember a case a long while ago, the little boy who got out of his garden and went wandering off down the street and he ended up falling into a neighbour's pond and drowning. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible accident. No, but there was a really sad thing, which was this guy said, I was driving along the road in my van and I saw this little kid out on his own, and I thought, oh, that's wrong. What's this little kid doing out on his own? And I was going to stop and talk to him and maybe put in the van. And then I thought, oh no, what will people think? They see me stopping in the van and taking this little kid. And so he didn't. And he tortured himself afterwards. You imagine how he felt. But it was that fear of, what will people think? And people think ill of me. But you're right. I mean, in debates, I think definitely people have become more fearful of expressing an opinion that's outside either of the norm or outside of their tribe because things are so polarized.
Yeah.
Uh, And I think that's a real shame because it means that there's no constraint on the group think of going off down some really bizarre and extreme roads. If the people within the group are not prepared to say, "Well, hang on, like this is crazy,"
Mhm.
don't you think this is going a bit far? Then there's absolutely nothing to constrain to quite extreme views, and anyone who challenges them from the outside just leads to the group coming together even more tightly and saying, "No, well, you see, they're attacking us, so that shows that we're right because the enemy is attacking us." I mean, there's the terrible,
Yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah, yeah.
terrible stuff at the moment about it's at the moment that the BBC have been criticised for bias in covering various subjects, and a number of the people defending the BBC are saying this is all a right-wing conspiracy to attack the BBC, and I feel like saying just because your enemies use something against you doesn't mean it's not true.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
you can't dismiss everything that your enemies use against you because sometimes they are using it against you, but there is something in it, and you need to deal with that thing. But I think it's very difficult at the moment, and we do all need to become a bit braver. I think about sticking our necks out and saying the unpopular thing. And the encouraging thing is that I mean it can take some time, but often people who do that It may take several years, but gradually word gets out and people go, yeah, actually they were right. They had a point, and people come around to their side. But yeah, it can be a hard and lonely few years if you're one of the first brave people to stick your neck out. But we need people to do that. We need people to be the first one with their head over the parapet and go, I think this is wrong.
So to delve into that last point in more detail, how do we start? Where's the starting point for that? Because there's got to be a point where you start putting your hand up. Actually, I think this is wrong. Once you do that, then it gets easier. But how do you get to that point in the first place?
I think to some extent you just have to go for it. You have to trust that feeling in you. I think we all get that feeling sometimes where you go, I'm really uncomfortable with this, the way this is being talked about, or the way this is being discussed, or the fact that nobody has raised this important point. And it's easy to ignore that. And sometimes it's necessary to ignore it. Sometimes you think, there's no point in me raising this here and now. This is not the place to have this fight because it won't change anyone's mind, and I will close myself off from future opportunities. But if you keep doing that, then you never do it. And yeah, sometimes I think you just have to trust that gut feeling, and your gut says, this is wrong, and I'm not comfortable with it. You have to open your mouth and say, I think this is wrong, and see what happens. And you're right, that is a risk because you don't know how people are going to respond. But quite often, I think people have found that they do that, and at least one other person goes, yeah, I'm glad you said that because I was thinking that, and I thought I
Mm,
was the only one.
yeah, indeed. So you said, just to quickly wrap up, that you're thinking of writing a book on this later
Yeah.
on, possibly. So have
Yes.
you started doing the research on that, and like how is that going? Or
I have started doing some research. Yeah. I'm trying to put together a proposal that sums up what it's about. I realized that there's two key points I think with risk that I'd like to put in the book. One of them is that we're often told that taking risks is irresponsible. And I would like to say, no, it's the other way around, actually, that you cannot be a responsible adult without taking risks, because taking responsibility for something, for seeing something through, means that you're taking responsibility for stuff that you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what. So my favorite example, weirdly, is when I took this show to Edinburgh. It was very interactive with the audience, which was really because I felt my life had got too safe and I wanted to take more risks. So I made the show very interactive with the audience so that I wasn't in control of the show and what would happen and how things would turn out. A lot of audience participation, which was randomized. And so one of the things I did, and I literally gave people like cloakroom tickets on the way in, so that I would randomize the audience participation and I would pick a number out of the hat and say, number 44, and it would be somebody in the audience. Number 44, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And one of the answers, there were all sorts of different answers, but one of the answers I didn't expect, but I got several times, was getting married. And there'd always be a bit of a kind of a giggle because they would usually be sat there with their spouse and sometimes with their children. So it's a bit like, well, that's a bit cheeky. It's like, you rolled a dice and you ended up with this person and it was a risk. But then we would all kind of take a step back and go, yeah, that's really interesting actually, because it's not just that you don't know everything about the person, but you have no idea what life is going to throw at you as you go down the road. Maybe you're going to have kids together. Maybe there's going to be particular challenges with the kids. There's going to be situations you didn't foresee. Maybe one of you will be ill. There's all sorts of things that you don't foresee. But when you've made the commitment to be married to somebody, you're not meant to be able to just go, oh yeah, but I didn't foresee that happening. I didn't sign up for that. That's the whole point of for richer, for poorer, sickness, health, and so on, is that you sign up going, right, this is a joint project of being married together and we're going to see it through. And we don't know what it's going to take. We don't know we're going to have to rise to situations that we never foresaw, but we're going to get opportunities we never imagined. We're going to probably maybe bring new people into the world that they're responsible for jointly. I mean, it's terrifying when you think about it, but you can see why people said that's a risk, but it's a risk in the wonderful way that only adults can take, because you go, right, I'm going to commit to this. I have no idea what I'm committing to in a sense, but I'm committing to seeing it through whatever it takes. And so I think the idea that taking risks is irresponsible is the wrong way around. It's like taking risks is responsible because you're taking responsibility for things.
Is
And
it?
that's the key thing that I would like to get across. I mean, and the other thing more broadly is just that we're too risk averse because we tend to see risk as a situation that you're in, a state of being. So you're at risk or you
Mm,
put yourself at risk. And then it's just like it's like you've gone and stood on the cross on the floor in a cartoon, and then you look up and there's the grand piano falling towards you. It's like that's what risk is. You've just stood on the cross and you hope the piano doesn't hit you. But I think you should think about risk instead as a mode of action, that a risk is something you take and you deliberately take on this open-ended responsibility and you act, and it's the only way to live as an adult.
Going back to your first point, obviously saying taking a risk is responsible, is also not taking a risk selfish? Because if you don't take a risk, then in a way someone else is always going to have to take that risk for you to protect you from harm, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that way before. But you're right. If you don't take risks yourself, then you are expecting to be protected in
Yeah.
many ways. Or society just doesn't move forward. So, for example, if nobody invested in the little nuclear reactors, then where is the energy going to come from we need in the future? I mean, wind and solar are great, but like we need a base load of energy. So there's always a risk, I guess, in not taking a risk, because the risk is that you don't advance, society doesn't progress, we don't get new things that we need. But yeah, you're right. I think not taking a risk and assuming someone else will protect you is selfish, and it's also, it's like you want to live as a child forever.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can hear that. And obviously, you got inventors as well who take risk, especially in somewhere like if you're talking from before Victorian times where religion played more of a part than science and the conflict between that. I mean, in my hometown of Birmingham, you got people like Lunar Society and the things I was thinking that led to riots. So there's always risk there, but then obviously there's once the destruction, then out of that comes hopefully progress once people understand what actually is going on.
Yeah. And political risks, because you think back to the whole Arab Spring thing, and everyone was like, "Oh, this is wonderful! Like people are using technology to liberate themselves," and there were lots of upheavals, and in the long run, a lot of those resulted in. I mean, Syria was just a terrible, terrible civil war for a number of years, and a lot of people died and suffered, and loads of destruction. It's a risk. It's like if you go, well, we want to be free, so we're going to have an uprising, and you don't know if it's going to work out and pull off, or maybe you're just planting the seeds of something and it's not going to actually come off for another 50 years, and in the meantime, you're putting yourselves and other people through very difficult things. But if nobody ever pushes for liberation or whatever, then things never change.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's been great talking to you as always. It's been a fascinating topic. I just thought a lot of more stuff actually been going into my head, and I imagine after this, some more will come into my head afterwards.
You've
Um,
given me loads of new things to think about. I should go write them down before I forget them all.
well, yeah, you can watch the interview again when they come up later. later. Um, if people want to find out more about your work and what you're planning to do writing wise, where can I go to?
Well, I do have a website, which is www.timandraharkness.com. So if you can spell my ridiculous name, you can find it really easily.
Yeah. If you want to spell a name, it'll be at the beginning of this interview, so just pause it
Thank
and note
you.
it down. Cool. But it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much again for coming onto 286 Project.
No, it's a pleasure. It's nice talking to you again, Chris.